Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Neslihan Şenocak to discuss St. Francis and the Order of Friars Minor, or the Franciscans. Dr. Şenocak specializes in medieval religious, intellectual, social, and political history. Her research and teaching focuses on popular religion, political theology, criminal justice, medieval Italian communes, and in particular, the way the emerging universities influenced theo-political institutions of medieval late Latin Christendom. Dr. Şenocak, thank you so much for joining with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk about Franciscans. I love it.
So before we discuss the Franciscans themselves and maybe the mendicant orders more generally, what can you tell us about medieval life in the 12th and 13th centuries? Were there any antecedents or precursors to mendicantism in the way of poverty?
Yes, certainly. So the issue of poverty in Christianity goes very long back. You know, it goes to the beginnings of the Christianity. In fact, already almost contemporaneous with the rise of Christianity, particularly in the East, you have these ascetic movements, right? People, in fact, it is sort of Saint Anthony of Egypt as being the first very well-known example of this hermit who denounces all property and then goes to the desert. And later on, you start this poverty issue being institutionalized in the 5th century. There are big movements around poverty. So it's not something particularly 12th and 13th century. Christianity had a difficult relationship, very complicated relationship with property and property holding. I mean, Peter Brown's book, Through the Eye of the Needle, is a wonderful story of how this actually developed in the late antiquity, the issue of the property. And there are two competing strands, if we may put it that way. So on one hand, there are people who think that the Christian clergy should be involved with property so that they can support the poor. If they are completely poor, have nothing of themselves, don't deal with money, how are they going to support the poor within the society? Because the early bishops, if you look at them, people like St. Andrews and Augustine of Hippo, they are very keen on supporting the poor in the early it is everywhere in the early clerical manuals, the support of the poor. But at the same time, the way things develop, the way the ascetic movements develop, this idea that one needs to be poor because Christ was poor. That is, Christ being God could have come on earth in any shape and form. He could have come as a king, he could have come as a rich man, but he came as a poor person. And what is the meaning of that? So there is this idea that the ideal Christian, the perfect Christian, needs to be Christ-like and therefore needs to be poor. There were even disputes whether the Christ and apostles together held money in common or they didn't. This actually got into the Franciscan history as well. So you come to the 12th century, these issues are already centuries old. And even before the Franciscans, there are other religious orders like the Grand Montagnes, for example, who also rejected communal property, like the Franciscans did. I think what is very distinctive about Franciscans is maybe not so much the total rejection of property and embrace of poverty, but the fact that they were in the midst of the people. They were not like monks. They were not tucked in some monastery out there in the countryside that, yes, they didn't have property, but people didn't have much engagement with them. Instead, what is distinctive about St. Francis is really that he wanted to be poor and he wanted to show to the people that it is possible to be happy and content while you're poor. So the early Franciscan movement has an element of happiness and joy that is going around singing songs. You know, Francis was known to sing troubadour songs in French. And that's how you convert people, really, psychologically. It's a great feat, actually, because people convert to your way of life, not because you're poor, but because you're happy. They see you, you know, not eating well and having just a single tunic, but going around laughing and smiling. And they think that, well, you know, this is what happens if I embrace poverty and if I embrace Christ. So that is what is distinctive, I would say, about Franciscans. But as I said, if you want me to talk a little bit about what was the religious panorama like before Franciscans came into the scene of history, you know, I would say that there were a lot of groups like Franciscans, like you know, Peter Valdo and the Valdensians is the very common example that people bring in, a movement that grew up in France. Peter Valdo being this rich merchant, almost very similar to Francis, having denounced everything, but of course they're at the same time not a very good example because they have been labeled as heretics because they disobeyed the bishop's orders not to preach. So then there are Cathars, and of course Cathars was a very big influence in Europe in the minds of all religious people, and historians think today that the great popularity of the Cathars was that they seem to be really holding on to their very strict ideals, particularly the Qatar perfect, you know, living really a poor life, renouncing everything material. So they set up a very good example to the people, particularly when people compare them to the rich property holding bishoprics. You know, on the one hand, you have this very rich clergy in their golden robes doing the liturgy in the churches. On the other hand, you have people like Waldensians or Catars, very poor. And, you know, that's another issue that was around at the time. I think Francis wanted to combine the two, you know, take the elements of the poverty and asceticism from these popular religious movements, but also be completely and absolutely obedient to the church in everything. Yeah.
Right. And as I understand it, another feature of early of mendicantism is that they're a religious order, but they're different from traditional religious orders like the Benedictines. And what would you say is the main difference between a monk and a friar? I mean, what distinguishes them?
Yes. Well, that is a very good question, and there is a huge difference, actually, really. And I don't think that is very well known in the popular arena, because I often see that Franciscans being referred as monks, Franciscan monks. And so monastic movement tends to be stable, not a mobile movement. That is, monks are steady and they remain inside their monasteries. They might go out if they are given special mission to preach, right? Or if they are sent to somewhere as some kind of papal legate, or for example, Cistercians, we know that preach the Crusades. But other than that, unless they have such special missions, they remain inside the monastery, and they are therefore not that visible to the public unless the public comes into the monastic church, you know, to join the mass or anything. They don't walk around, the monks, in between people, right? So that is the greatest difference, really, a difference of visibility, for one thing. Second, Franciscans, you know, they had also their convents or friaries, as we call them, but we don't call them monasteries because they were allowed to go wherever they like, mingle with the people. In fact, it was desirable that they were in the midst of people so people would see them. But also, of course, one has to say immediately that the Franciscans, as well as Dominicans, are urban movements. They grow up in the cities, and their first settlement are always in the cities, not in the countryside. That's another difference. Monasteries tended to be in the countryside, because the monastic movement is a movement in which a monk separates himself from the rest of the society. It is a way of dying to the world as it is, so that you can embrace the new life, the spiritual life, the way of Christ. And that cannot be done unless you're dead to the society. So their relationship with the society, with their families, are very much severed. In the case of the friars, it's so completely the contrary. They don't want a severed relationship with the society. They want to be in the midst of them. They want to communicate with them. And the result of that is that, of course, Franciscans also very slowly in time have taken on some of the pastoral functions of the priests. For example, preaching in particular, hearing confessions, another one, burials, though that happens in the monasteries too. But as the popularity of the mendicants increased in the cities, people more flocked to them. Yeah, I think that I would say are the biggest differences. Other differences more on the religious side. The monastic liturgy tends to be much more elaborate, much longer hours of praying. You know, monks essentially are a praying body. That's what they do. They sit in their monasteries and they spend the very big chunk of their day praying, whereas Franciscans do other things. Their liturgy is much shortened. You know, they don't have that many long masses. Their divine office is much shortened compared to the older traditions, because, you know, they really do not have time to spend all their time with praying and the liturgical celebrations inside their convents, because they go out, they teach, they preach, they hear confessions. They also beg for food, at least initially. That was the case. Later on, you know, begging becomes really complicated. Yeah.
As I understand it, another trend that you might see is very often much of the noble class, they're the second or third in maybe in line to inheriting some sort of estate, they would be sent to a monastery in the hopes that maybe they might become abbot one day, maybe. And would you say that it's all possible that during the 12th and 13th centuries, these monasteries had the reputation of garnering a lot of wealth for themselves?
Yes, that is almost certainly true. I mean, most of the monasteries tended to be wealthy, although not all. And also, you know, there are huge differences between one monastery and the other. There are very big monasteries, like think about Monte Cassino or Cluny, where, you know, some of them housed hundreds of monks, and there were, you know, smaller monasteries. Not all monasteries were very wealthy. But it is true that, you know, at least early on, throughout the early Middle Ages and later too, monasteries have been an attraction to the nobility, particularly because it was a dignified form of life. You know, the manual labor was always in the Benedictine rule, but as we know, the manual labor was sort of modified to do more dignified manual labor, like copying and writing texts, rather than, you know, doing farming. Even Cistercians, for example, started off as a reform movement in which they wanted to do their own farming. But these things, you know, are very much in flux. And you have to look at what century, exactly what geography, before we can make such generalizations. Whereas the mendicants, on the other hand, initially at least, they really did not draw that much aristocracy or the nobility. But because they were urban movements, they appealed to the urban middle class. You know, in fact, there's a very good about this Lester Little's religious profit economy and the religious movements, and talking about the mendicants, why they have particularly become popular in the cities, because there was a rising wealth generally, a bigger middle class that had a comfortable living, and that sort of created a reaction in peoples where they wanted to embrace the poverty as a social movement. But later on, you know, you also find the nobility joining the Franciscans as well. It's difficult to say, you know, we just don't know what's in the minds of the people, why they're particularly attracted to one movement over the other. But there are revisionist histories too, like John Van Engen, for example, wrote an article against this idea that there was a decline of the monasticism, and he argued, you know, if you look at the numbers, there doesn't seem to be a real decline in monasticism either, just because mendicants came along. Yeah, it's a very complicated issue.
Right. If I can then ask, who was Saint Francis of Assisi, and why did he decide to found the Order of Friars Minor?
Well, yeah, we know a lot about who St. Francis of Assisi was because of his life being written by Thomas of Celano and written very shortly after his death. The life was commissioned, and then there are other records about Francis's life written by his companions. So the story goes is that he was a young man in Assisi whose father was a cloth merchant. So therefore, he had a very comfortable, what we can do, well-to-do upbringing. And initially, he was a very carefree young person in his, I don't know, maybe 16, 18-year-old going around in Assisi, had a bunch of friends there, and had some kind of, really wild teenager life in those years, but didn't have much interest in religion whatsoever. But the legend from that we learn from the life is that he was imprisoned for a short while once during the War of Assisi with Perugia. And during that imprisonment, and later on also there is a sickness that he went through. That time was sort of, in a way, I don't want to say traumatic because it's got a bad connotation. Maybe he had some kind of conversion. I think in his early 20s maybe, and he decided to take up this life, the life of Christ. He was very keen on literally living like Christ lived. I mean, that was his idea, whatever the historical Christ as we know his life from the Bible did, that was what Francis wanted to do, a very literal imitation of Christ's life. So he then got into, first of all, there is a slow transition. I mean, he continued helping to his father with merchandise selling and stuff, trade. But even then, there are the episodes in which he would take the money that he got from selling the clothes and then give it to the priest of the local church in Assisi. And the priest not wanting to, have this money because he would know that he would get into trouble because this money came actually from the clothing merchandise, and it wasn't Francis's, it was Francis's father. And Francis had great resistance, met with resistance, particularly from his father, who really wanted apparently his son to follow in his footsteps, become a cloth merchant like him, take on the business. And one of the most famous, in fact, paintings about Francis's life is this episode in which he, in the middle of the town square of Assisi, he's in a dispute with the father, and the father says, everything you have is mine, so how can you give these things? I even gave you your clothes. And Francis, in reaction to this, just goes full Monty, takes up all his clothes and throws them to his father. And there is this painting of Giotto in which he points to the sky, meaning that my father from now on, I have only one father, and the Father, God in the sky, you're not my father anymore. And the bishop comes in and gives his robe to Francis, so covers him as he's standing naked in front of the whole Assisi looking onto the scene. So that, in a way, I think is the pivotal moment, as we learn from the Vita, from the artistic representations, in which Francis abandoned one life, abandoned the family, and then took up another life. And of course, changing of the habit, changing of the dress is very symbolic in Christianity, particularly in the Middle Ages. Once you get rid of your clothes and you don a different kind of habit, you are now a different kind of man. It's the start of a new life. So that's how it all starts. And then the first years in Francis, he's alone actually in the streets of Assisi, living completely by the food that people give to him, donate to him. He's begging his way around. He takes up repairing old churches, literally putting stone over stone, trying to rebuild the churches. And in a few years' time, his friends, old friends from his, disco days, join him in this religious life one by one. And they make a group. And when there are 12 people, Francis decides that he needs permission because he wants to live a different kind of religious life. He doesn't want to be a monk. He doesn't want to be a hermit, who goes and lives somewhere unseen. There are eremitic elements certainly in him, like now and then he escapes to the forest and stays there for a while, particularly in the evening, but then in the morning he's back again in town in the midst of the people. So he says, in fact, in his rules, that when there were discussions about the rule, he says, God sent me to this earth to be a new kind of fool, patsus novus, that he's not like any other religious people, and he doesn't want to be. So then, together with his friends, he goes to the Pope Innocent III, asks permission to have this new kind of life, to have no property whatsoever, going around preaching. And Innocent gives him permission to live the way he wants to live with his friends. And he just says, stay clear of any kind of doctrinal preaching, because these are the people who doesn't have any kind of theology education. We know that they knew Latin because we have their letters. Francis could read and write, but there is no evidence whatsoever that he ever studied Bible, ever took a class in theology in his life. So the kind of preaching he does is a very simple preaching, the earliest preaching, is basically going around asking people to repent their sins, to remind them that Christ will come again, and they should get ready for the next life. So anything, the kind of preaching that anyone could do in a way that doesn't require theological information. And so, Innocent sends a circular letter to all bishops saying that, these are our, we approve of this order and let them preach wherever they can, because, the permission to preach in any place in the medieval Europe depends on the local bishop. If you want to preach, you have to go to the bishop and ask permission to preach. You can't just walk in a town square and preach there. And Francis early on made very sure that if a bishop objects to their preaching for whatever reason, that they would just go to the next town. They wouldn't engage in any kind of dispute with the bishops. If they are not wanted there, they would just quietly leave. Unlike Peter Waldo, who claimed, for example, his right to preach. He reportedly said, I don't obey men, I only obey God. And because Francis proved himself to be very obedient to the existing church hierarchy, he never got into trouble being labeled as heretic in any way, didn't get into trouble with any kind of bishops. And his whole demeanor, charisma, he was an, amazing man in many ways, very peaceful. He was, in fact, called upon to many towns in Italy in those early years. If there is a town in which there were different political factions that people couldn't get on well, couldn't have a peaceful governance, he would be called as a peacemaker. There are episodes of him being in Bologna, preaching to the people, and he sort of convinced people somehow with the way he looked. He's known to be a small man, not very attractive or not grandiose in his appearance. This little man coming in with his very poor tunic, patched here and there, and, giving a very inspired sermon about love, about God, about joys of following Christ. And I think he himself really made it such a huge impact on the people that very many people joined this movement very early on. Already in 1220, you have more than 1,000, maybe 5,000 people in the order. So very swiftly, the order grows, from 12 people to 5,000 in a matter of years. So that's in a nutshell how St. Francis was.
And what were the early Franciscans like? Was there any stringent or clear structuring to the order, like that, like there was maybe in the order of preachers? Like how, did it develop organically? Like how would you describe it?
Yeah, I mean the development of the order, really, the joining of the new people, that's all very interesting because Francis did not put up any kind of restrictions for the new recruits coming into the order. Like he didn't say to them, "Oh, you have to bring a certain amount of money," which is the case in the monasteries. Like, in fact, that should be mentioned. Another difference between the monastic movement and the early Franciscan movement is that anybody could join the Franciscans. You still had to go through the novitiate because that was already um, put into canon law and it was existing before Franciscans came onto the scene. That means you can't from one day to the next become a Franciscan friar. You have to have a period of 6 months, 1 year. 1 year is what is really ascribed by the canon law. Live with the Franciscans and they should observe you whether you're fit to this life. And at the end of that year, if you're, still keen on following that life, you then take your profession and become a full-fledged friar. But apart from that, apart from the necessity of doing the novitiate, he didn't care if people were educated, uneducated, if they were farmers. He let in everyone, which in fact later on in the 1230s, some Franciscans in the order, particularly the educated party, thought that that's not a good idea. So you see that these two strands in Christian religious life plays out a lot in the Franciscan life. That is, religious life is the life of dignity. There has to be, if there is a religious person, they need to be dignified. Franciscans did not look dignified because they were poor. They didn't even have a place to stay. They slept in the streets or slept wherever people have shown them a room. Sometimes they slept in the stables. They did not fit to the idea of the traditional religious person who bears a certain amount of dignity, who distinguishes himself from the ordinary people by way of his long habit and the way he moves and things like that. But so the Franciscan order initially was an order of everyone, open to everyone, to all classes, all socioeconomic classes, poor as well as the rich. And what they have done in the early years is that, again, depending on where they are, we know that they spent a lot of time in the towns, they preached, they sang songs, they danced, literally just being in the face of the people, sort of almost like bringing Christ to the people's life, making it visible outside of the church and everything. Preaching definitely was a big part of it, of the early moments, going around preaching in the town squares or wherever they were shown a place to preach. But as I said, always, calling into the repentance. But then very slowly, the educated people joined the movement and Franciscans somehow seek them out. I mean, that's how my book on the rise of the learning in the Franciscan order starts. In fact, it starts with the story of this Franciscan brother from Umbria going all the way to Paris to start a convent there. And my question was, why Paris? Why would you go all the way from Italy to all the way to Paris, walking there to start a convent? I mean, there's no other reason why they would do that, go all the way to Paris, other than it being the university town, of course. And they wanted to attract the university students. And I guess they thought that maybe, I don't know who thought that. It might be Franciscans also very early on had advisors from the papal court, like the Cardinal Ugolino, who has then become Gregory IX, the Pope, was the cardinal protector of the order. He's known to be a man who was, who admired Francis, but also felt that he should act in an advisory capacity. Maybe even outside of the order, there were worries that this order is growing very quickly and admitting everyone, what if it turns heretic? What if things don't what if they start steering away from accepted theological doctrines? So apparently, there was some ideas in the order that they should try to attract more educated people who can teach the friars and teach them theology or teach them how to read and write. Later on, people like Bonaventure in the 1250s, who was the Minister General of the Order and one of the greatest Franciscan saints, in fact, he said that they had to acquire learning because they need to preach, and they don't want to preach fables and stories to the people. They want to preach religion and doctrine. They want to explain Bible, so they need the learning for that. But I had skepticism about that, whether that was a way of justification, because learning, if you don't have money, learning is the second best way to acquire dignity and respect. And that, in a way, contrasts with what Francis wanted to do. Francis wasn't really interested in the dignity in a worldly sense. He wasn't interested to have people's respect and admiration, the way he moved, the way he talked, the way he dressed. He was only interested, I think, to have people's love and admiration, the way he has come closest as possible to Christ. The social norms, accepted social norms, didn't interest him. And if there is any point that I feel, and I'm obviously not even a Christian, I was raised in Turkey as a Muslim. What to me is so admirable in Francis, that he was able to withstand this huge social current that pushed him towards a respectable, dignified life, where people sort of praise you and applaud you because you're very educated or because you're a noble. He really didn't seem to care for that at all. And that requires really guts, that requires tremendous inner strength. And he found that strength in his vocation. All he cared was, how well I can be Christ-like. And of course, later on, you have the stigmata, the story in which, in fact, God also seems to have approved that he is Christ-like by giving him Christ's wounds, what we call stigmata. Right. Sorry, I talked a lot. Yeah. If I'm steering from your question, please let me know.
No, this is amazing. So if I can maybe follow up with respect to Franciscan education, I mean, how did early Franciscans take to entering universities? I know, as you said, it seems very early on that Franciscans and Dominicans want to seek out maybe convents near universities. But was there ever any dispute regarding Franciscans reading or writing or?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. And in fact, it is the heart of the book that I have written. So the early Franciscans are very different from the Franciscans of 1230s, really. So we need to look on exactly what time period, and things change very quickly in the order, in a matter of years. Particularly once Francis dies, it's a whole different order now. But Francis himself reportedly has said that he said, I wish I could unlearn the learned friars coming into the order. I wish they could abandon their learning. And I think what he means with that is that not that they become complete ignorant, but because there is something about learned people that they sometimes tend to see themselves superior to the unlearned. Maybe saying sometimes is an understatement. Often there is something about the learned people, the intellectual class, that they bask in this glory of having learned, being educated. And of course, this still continues in the modern life. Parents want their kids to be educated, there's a huge interest into the books, which is all fine. And I don't think Francis would ever mind someone applying themselves to learning, but he looks at Christ's life, and Christ in Bible doesn't go to schools, doesn't sit down and write books. He doesn't come across from the Bible as an intellectual person, right? So you don't really particularly need to be learned or educated in order to achieve salvation, to be Christ-like. If anything, learning is not necessary, superfluous to the to Francis's project in his mind. But apart from that, there is a danger of the learning, and that makes you proud. And pride and vanity is to be at all costs avoided. I mean, that is why the order is not called Franciscans. That's a name we have later given on the Franciscans. The order is called Friars Minor. And that word minor, its connotation in medieval life is lowly. You can it is translated as little brothers, but even that doesn't really do it, because someone minores versus mayores, that is the low class of people in the society, mayores being the rich, the powerful, those who govern the society, and the minores are the people who are, just get on by with whatever they have. The poorer class is definitely included in it. It's not just, the issue is not just poverty, the issue of not having any kind of power, not doing any sort of governance, not putting yourself out there, and to lead people, to take people, And Francis's life is such, therefore, as a scene of controversy. You need hundreds of psychologists to study what happened to Francis, because this is a man who wants to refute all forms of power, reject them. He wants to be humble and lowly as possible. But he's also the leader of a religious movement that has thousands of people. So he's really conflicted. How am I going to lead them if I don't want to be a leader of anything or anyone? Right? How do you do that? How do you start a movement that is supposed to be lowly and shun from all forms of power? But you're the one who started the movement. Everyone looks up to you. You're the one who's supposed to give laws and set up statutes and regulations. So that means power, That is difficult. And education is the key point about education is that it gives power to people, and it makes them vain often. So that was the main objection, I think, that Francis and the early Franciscans might have had against the educated friars in the order, who then wanted to administer the order because they were educated. And in a way, sort of, it is a natural process. If there's an educated person, well, whoever is in the leading capacity of the order is the one who is going to correspond with bishops, correspond with the Pope, because this order exists within the hierarchy of the church. You need someone who can write letters. You need someone who knows how to speak to the Pope, to the bishop, right? You don't want to put someone, a complete peasant, to a leading position in the Franciscan order who then cannot fulfill these positions, right? So there is that natural process. Naturally, therefore, starting from 1230s onwards, you see always that the Franciscan governing position, the ministerial positions within the order, goes to the educated friars. Friars who have spent a few years in Paris or elsewhere in Bologna, in Italy, in the schools. They know how to read and write. And in fact, starting from 1240s onwards, those positions always go to those who study theology. So there are multiple reasons why Franciscans sought out education. I think one reason is that because they wanted the friars, entering friars, to learn a little bit at least about theology. They didn't want them to be completely ignorant, and they also wanted to have a form of respectability, dignity in the face of, in a way that because they are functioning within the hierarchy of the church, they needed people to lead the order, and that has sort of come to the forefront. But if you ask me in practice how it happened, in practice, this is how it happened. This is a group of Franciscans, 4, 5, 9, whatever it is. Really, a handful of friars would go to a university town. And first of all, they would make connections there with whomever they already know. For example, in Paris, they had help from the Dominicans, who had already settled in Paris before. So the Dominicans set them up in a place so that they can sleep. And then they start going into the university and preaching there, this new movement, the Franciscan movement, and, try to attract the attention of the students. And then the students or some of the masters start joining the order, seeing their way of life. And One thing, of course, a great selling point, even though I don't say it in a cynical way, I just want to say it as a, from a modern marketing perspective. What Franciscans claimed was that we are the people who live the gospel, and you study and learn the gospel. And they sort of asked this question, rhetorical question, isn't it better if you live the gospel rather than reading about it? That was how they recruited students in the universities. Come and be with us, and you're going to live the life of gospel, not just read it in the books, Or they said, in a way, I mean, your teaching or studying of the Bible will be so much more powerful if you actually live the way Christ lives in the Gospels. And later on, Franciscans like Bonaventure or the other minister generals always pushed that front when they were trying to recruit students and masters in the universities. We are more perfect than other religious orders because we live the gospel as well as studying and teaching it. And it again, very swiftly, they had great success. There were masters who joined the order. And once a theology doctor who has a chair in the university joins the Franciscan order, then that chair becomes permanently a Franciscan position. I mean, that's how the first big doctor of theology to join the Franciscans in the early 1230s was Alexander of Hales, who was in fact English. But he joined the order in Paris. And this is sort of like, I don't know how to explain that, maybe, I don't know, like Michel Foucault becoming a monk. Alexander of Hales was such a famous person, students and the other professors, he was a man of stature. He was one of the most popular teachers, and he becoming Franciscans then opens the floodgates in a way to many other students and teachers in the universities becoming a Franciscan. In England, similarly, Robert Grosseteste, who was a very well-known bishop, had taken an interest in Franciscans, and he has started to give them free lessons of theology. He started to frequent the convent, and he was the major connection between the Franciscans and the learned world.
It's very interesting that you say that it's when these well-respected figures start joining the order that much of the order starts to become very comfortable and well acquainted with the universities. But how did the clergy by and large react to the mendicant friars, specifically the Franciscans overall? Was there any controversy regarding the Franciscans or their commitment to their vows of poverty?
Yes. Yes, that's a great question. And also, an important point concerning education before I move to the clerical reaction is that once the educated friars have taken on the positions of the general minister and provincial minister, they started very early on making statutes where they have created a support network within the order for education to be disseminated. It's, for example, in 1228, just 2 years after Francis died, they have introduced a new position in the order called the lectors. The lectors. So these were the teachers in the order where they would teach in the convents. And preacher was another position. And then they started to regulate, which of our convents is going to have a school and how many people are we going to send to University of Paris to get theology education. These started to be all regulated because the educated friars in the ministerial positions supported this kind of reform. Okay, so let me move on to the clergy and their reactions. So that also is a very complicated issue. And it's, I must say, it is very localized in many ways. So there is one aspect of it is the well-known disputes in the University of Paris from the non-friar, non-mendicant religious people who were teaching there, who were holding the chairs of theology. They were not very happy with some of the aspects of the Franciscans and Dominicans. In practice, it seems the conflicts between them seems to have come to the forefront from very solid instances. For example, if there was a dispute between the university administration and the town people, the town gown conflict, as it is called in history. The way the university responded to that was to go on strike. They would stop all teaching, you know. And in the more severe cases, they even left the university towns altogether and migrated to another university if they felt that the town was being biased against them. Whenever the University of Paris would go on strike, Franciscans and Dominicans wouldn't. They would not follow the university regulations, so they would do their own thing. I mean, their teachers, theology teachers, would continue to teach. And of course, your strike is, you know, they're crossing the picket line. And that wasn't something that appealed to the other professors. But I think also there is the issue that because they were becoming very swiftly popular, they were attracting more and more students to their classes. And the secular masters, what we call the secular masters, that is those who are not Franciscans, Dominicans, see diminished enrollment in their classes. And I think there is also a fact that Franciscans and Dominicans from 1240s onwards started to be much more vocal about their vocation, in the sense that they started to advertise themselves as the perfect religious, which I think would upset Francis very much, because Francis never wanted to be anyone to be vain or proud. You know, if you're following Christ, that is not something you should show around to people as if you're showing them a new Ferrari or something. So that was the first account of the conflicts, you know, the attitude of the boastful attitudes of the mendicants, the fact that they wouldn't follow the university regulations, that brought them into clash within the university circles with the secular masters. But that is a very confined area, a very specific area of the secular clergy versus mendicants dispute. Now, there is a bigger area of that dispute happening in all over Europe in the towns and parishes. So when Franciscans moved into the towns around Europe and started to have their own churches, what happened is that because they were becoming very swiftly popular among the people started to go their churches instead of their own parish churches. You know, imagine you're a parish priest and Sunday you're getting ready to do the mass and you look at the church and there are few people in the church when there used to be, you know, hundreds of people coming in. So where are all your audience? They are in the Franciscan church because they like the sermon better there. And why do they like the sermon better? Because the sermon is given by an educated man. You know, somebody who has just returned from Paris after having studied 2 years of theology has come to the Franciscan church in that town and giving a sermon. So of course people want to go and hear that man instead of their own old parish priest. And also there is an element of novelty too. And preaching is very much related to the confession in the Middle Ages. That is, people confess after having heard a sermon. You know, they don't just in their mind say, oh, let me go today and confess. Maybe some of the very devout do. But what happens is that you hear a sermon in the Sunday Mass, and after the Mass, you're moved spiritually by what the preacher told you. Maybe the preacher, you know, preached the hellfire and what will happen to you if you die with sin. So you go and confess. So therefore, the natural consequence of Franciscans preaching is that people wanted to confess to the Franciscans instead of their own parish priest. And this way they developed an affinity, a relationship with the Franciscan friars. And the result of that relationship is also there are monetary consequences. So if you're going to donate money to the church, instead of donating money to your parish church, you donate the money to the Franciscan church because you support them more. They seem to you poor, you know, they seem more genuine religious in some way. Or if you're dying, instead of bequeathing money in your will to the parish priest or your own priest, you leave the money to the Franciscan church and the friars. And also there is the other issue of the burials. Now the burials among all the sacraments is the one that involves most money, because there are burial fees and tips that are given to the priests once the Franciscans admit somebody for burial into their church, into the cemetery. In fact, so they got So the Franciscans originally did not have any burial rights, because the established idea in the Christian canon law is that you're supposed to be buried in the church that you're baptized. You close the cycle in the same place. You belong to a church as the member of the laity. So you should be baptized there, you should be confessing to that priest, and you should be buried there, right? But Franciscans received from the Pope the right to burial quite early on. And therefore, they could admit the laity to be buried, and then they would admit also all the money that comes with the burial. And that's loss of income for the secular clergy, for the parish priests. So that created enormous conflicts in the towns. I have read actually in Modena, 14th century disputes between the secular clergy of Modena and the Franciscans. They were asking Franciscans to send at least 1/3 of the all burial fees, because it diminishes the property of the churches when the Franciscans accept all that money. Well, and also technically Franciscans are not supposed to accept money. They're supposed to be poor, but they have become very possessive of all those money that they were getting in the later 13th century. All that idea that we are supposed to be poor in many convents just flew out of the window. They found the practical means of admitting that money through what was called spiritual friends, or through the papacy, and somehow that money still trickled into the convents. And there is also the sign of hypocrisy. That's in hypocrisy to many of the secular clergy. You have an order here who claims to be poor, both communally and privately, yet they are so keen on collecting burial fees. How can you not be mad? So that's another aspect of the clerical displeasement, let's say, with the friars. But this is all local. We should not generalize it. It happens in some towns. It doesn't happen in the others. In certain towns, the parish priests and the mendicants might get on really well. I'm just saying basically to you whatever I have seen in the documents.
Right. And if I can maybe follow up with respect to Paris especially, were there any major disputes between the secular clergy, or the clergy that didn't belong to a mendicant religious order, and the mendicants? Because as I understand it, a lot of the secular clergy, it looked like to them that the mendicants were sort of like taking up all the chair positions in the university, and they kind of saw that as problematic.
Well, yes. I mean, in the late 1250s, there have been this huge dispute in Paris. I think that's what you're referring to in particular, right? What we call the secular mendicant dispute. It's not just Franciscans; it's Franciscans and Dominicans together against the secular masters. Well, there was this particular one man, William of Saint Amour, who really couldn't stand the mendicants. I mean, if you read he has written on the dangers of the recent days, or on the dangers of our times. We can translate it from the Latin, and those dangers being the friars themselves. I mean, William of Saint Amour, I think, thought of them as really some kind of antichrists and very hypocritical people who claim to be poor, yet who are very vain, who do not in any way listen or take into consideration the concerns of the secular masters in any way. Also, I mean, he made some very good points, William of Saint Amour. He said that, what is exactly the place of the mendicants within the existing church hierarchy? Because up until that point, you have the parish system, right? There is the bishop appoints the priests, and then the priests are responsible of administering the sacraments to the public. That's how the system is set up. And all of a sudden, these Franciscans and Dominicans come, and they do not belong to the traditional church hierarchy, in the sense that they are not under the administration of the bishop. They are under the administration directly of papacy. So whatever relation they have with the church hierarchy, it goes through the Pope. The bishops can't even touch the Franciscans, because there are the papal letters saying, the Franciscans can have burial rights, they can hear confessions. So the bishop has no means of stopping them. telling them, because the papal letter supersedes the bishop's position on this. So they become like a second alternative church hierarchy, right? And that's also very questionable. What is it that exactly that they do, particularly because they have taken on pastoral functions. So they take on the pastoral functions, but in a very strange ways, because both Dominicans and Franciscans actively refused to be parish priests. That is, a Franciscan church could not be a parish church. You could not be baptized in a Franciscan church, or you could not, a Franciscan friar could never become a parish priest. The orders didn't want it. Both of the orders didn't want it anyway. They were keen on doing other things, like the pursuit of education, for example, or acting as inquisitors. They did jobs that were given to them by the papacy, but they had no interest in being parish priests. But yet, they had no official interest being a parish, but they have taken on the functions of the parish priest. So where do they belong in the church hierarchy? That was a question that William of St. Amour brought in. And he called them false apostles. That they claim to live like apostles, they claim to be Christ-like, but they are false because they don't belong into the existing church hierarchy. Their role is undefined. And then they're also vain, they have been accused of a lot of things, of greed, of hoarding their books, that the Franciscans wouldn't share their books. They started to develop considerable amount of libraries, and they started hoarding books, Franciscans and Dominicans alike, and they wouldn't share them with the others in the university towns. They wouldn't open their libraries to the people, and that sort of raised concerns about, like, what kind of friars are you? You claim not to have any kind of property, yet whatever you use, you don't want to share with anyone. So that was another issue. Anyway, William of St. Amour wrote this very, toxic treatise, and some of the things he said in that treatise was later found heretical. So his position was terminated. In the end, he lost the battle against the mendicants, and that's in a way settled the dispute forever. No secular master really. There were others like Gerard d'Abbeville in the 1260s who was. But the dispute really did not go anymore about whether the friars are lawful or not, or whether they belong to the church. The dispute became, who is more perfect? Is someone who has the real pastoral function, like a bishop or parish priest, or is someone who's a friar, or is someone who's a monk? Which of these religious lives is the more perfect life? That's what the dispute has become between the mendicants and the secular masters. So secular masters obviously thought that any office with a official pastoral function is the most valuable religious life that one can have. Friars defended their way of life. But after William of St. Amour, no one really questioned the existence of the friar within the hierarchy, because I guess they were afraid of what happened to William of St. Amour. But William of St. Amour's own treatise was prompted by a treatise written by a Franciscan friar, an Italian Franciscan friar, Gerardo di Borgo di San Donino, who has written something that has been found quite heretical, and he has been put into imprisonment for life for the treatise that he has written. That's a very interesting story too. So sort of a really tragic story. So this Italian friar sits down and says, because Francis was given the stigmata, and Francis appears to be the Christ in many ways, a new Christ, the Franciscan rule supersedes the Bible. And it is the real gospel now. And the friars sort of signal the third age. After the second age, so the first age is the age of the Father God, the second age is the age of Christ. And with the coming of St. Francis and the Franciscans, a new age starts in Christian history. And that is the third age, the age of the Holy Spirit. And the friars represent the Holy Spirit, and therefore their way of life and their rule must be given the utmost importance. Of course, you can imagine, what how this sounded to everyone around. Very heretical, very vain, very greedy in many ways, and it was almost instantly deemed as heretical. And William of St. Amour treatise comes in the face of this writing.
So then if I can ask, we've discussed a lot about disputes between maybe secular clergy and the Franciscans or mendicant friars, but were there any major debates in the Franciscans themselves, like inter-Franciscan debates regarding the vows of poverty or in the early stages of the Franciscans?
Well, yes, of course, yes, there was, and historians still dispute when those disputes really started, because and one of the best books to read about this is David Burr's Spiritual Franciscans. So a group appeared in the late 13th century within the Franciscan order who are known to be at the time already as fratres spirituales, that is spiritual friars, as opposed to the friars who were more carnal, who were more interested in the material stuff. So the spiritual friars were deemed to be more interested in the spirituality of Franciscans, less interested in education and dignity, more Francis-like in a way. But as I said, there are disputes about when this division in the order starts, how early it starts, because we have a 14th century chronicle written by one of these spiritual friars called Angelo Clerical, an Italian friar, who claims that this division within the order between those who wanted to have a more materially comfortable life and those who wanted more to follow Francis and Christ ad litteram, that started already during the life of Francis, he claimed. But David Burr sort of qualifies that very well, and I think that in an order like Francis's order, it is impossible not to have disputes about what should we do. And both parties have very good justification about what they should be doing. Educated friars, many of them were actually quite interested in the poverty, and they themselves personally followed very much the regulations on poverty. So they themselves did not have anything to do with money and on a personal level, but on a communal level, they supported education, whereas the spiritual Franciscans thought that a lot of this education, taking on the positions of bishops, inquisitors, it's all sort of takes one away from a life of Christ. It's just too much interference. And I think they thought in some way that while the educated friars might say all the right things about why they want education, because they want to teach people about the Christian doctrine, they suspected that deep down, this is vanity. I mean, they want to be educated, they want to be in an educated order, they want to be associated and live with educated people because it serves their sense of self better. And it's unavoidable in a way in any kind of human organization, these kind of disputes, particularly when you have such a strict ideal as following Christ. Literally, it's a very strict ideal. And once you have an institution of thousands of people, there will be other voices. Anyway, so these disputes start becoming much more within the order, much more solid and palpable in the 1270s, when some of the convents literally rebel against the provincial minister. I mean, because they think that the provincial minister is introducing relaxations to the rule. For example, I mean, the easiest example, Franciscans start eating really well, but they're not supposed to eat well. They're supposed to fast most of the time. They're not supposed to have 3 courses. You go to a friar's convent, and because poor people don't have 3 courses, right? They don't have good wines and stuff. I mean, this is built into the Franciscan rule. Francis, in his rule, says that our way of poverty is the altissima paupertas, that is the highest poverty. We are supposed to be poorer than the poorest member of the society. And then the dispute starts becoming, what exactly poverty is. I have also written an article about this. So the educated party claims that the real poverty is not owning property. It's not so much about how you are seen or how you live, but you should not own any kind of property, particularly landed property, because property, let's face it, from the Romans onwards, really means landed property until you get these very rich merchants coming into towns. But even then, it translates still property, because even people who do money through trade start buying land, start buying houses. Franciscans, very unlike the monasteries, never had landed property. They didn't have farms, fields. They didn't, they refused any kind of such gifts. They allowed cash gifts. They allowed gifts, for food and for pittances and things like that, but not land. And educated friars thought that, this is enough. This is enough to distinguish us from others, because we know that we own nothing, neither communally nor privately, but we need certain things like books or like good food so that we can study. I mean, how is someone going to study and teach if they fast all the time? You won't be able to think clearly if you're not eating, And so you see the arguments at both sides were very logical in many ways, but the spiritual friars thought that, these are all distractions, and they convert the order into something that it wasn't, and they wanted much stricter following of the rule. And of course, that division grew and grew during the 13th century. In fact, in 1311, it has become so palpable, this conflict within the order, that the Pope had to call both parties into Vienna and hold a council. And he called the spokesman for the spiritual friars and the spokesman for the rest of the order, and made them argue with one another. What is the problem? What do you want? And what do you want? One of the things that the spiritual Franciscans argued, for example, that the Franciscans were now begging much more aggressively. Like they were saying that friars go out in the street and they beg, and if people don't give them money, they curse them. And that is, obviously not acceptable. You don't give me money and I'm cursing you for that. I mean, what kind of a behavior coming from Franciscans is this? Or they started to have books, buy books, sell books within the order, because books in a way replaced money, because they couldn't have money, they couldn't deal with cash within the order, so books have become like currency. Ubertino de Casal, in front of the Pope, in fact, said that, the friars use the books like for retirement. They hoard the books that they can't even read. And then they say, oh, when I come to my retirement, I'm going to sell these books and I'm going to use the money for myself in my old age. This kind of practices started to come about. And of course, unfortunately, this division has been never healed. And the order in the later 14th century divided into two completely, as observant friars, who have become the heirs of the spiritual friars, and the conventual friars, who represented the rest of the order. And to this day, this division exists. It has never healed. There are the conventual friars and the friars minor, who are the observants. And then in the 16th century, you get another reform current, and that brings forth the Capuchin order. Because even the observant friars themselves split then into two, which has become the Capuchins.
Right. So if I can ask, what exactly became of the friars after the disputes? I know you talked about how they sort of faction and split off, but did the Franciscans for a time sort of garner any sort of negative reputation of laxity among maybe the laity or the general populace?
Yes, almost certainly they did. In fact, this is one of the best examples, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and then you also have the Decameron of Boccaccio, where there is this idea of the friars being fat, because they're not fasting. They're very much into, material comforts, that they become womanizers, friars as womanizers, going around being greedy and all that. Yeah, so there is a lot of what we call the anti-fraternal literature around, coming up in the 14th century in the secular literature, with these, particularly these authors, but many others, that where there are these sarcastic definitions of the friars. Even today, if you go to Assisi, they do these mugs, really thick mugs, where the whole mug is a friar. It sort of is in a way, a joke about the friars being generally fat and quite overweight instead of being slim, because they don't fast enough. So that has continued at certain levels, but side by side with that, the laity's support of the friars does not seem to diminish. And that you see by looking at the testaments, wills, donations. The Franciscans are very much in the forefront in their relationships with the laity. There is that criticism, definitely. But despite that criticism, there is also a great deal of love for the friars still, that people wanted to be associated with the friars. They want to be buried in the Franciscan churches. I mean, Dante Alighieri is buried in the Franciscan church of Santa Croce in Florence, right? They go hand in hand. There is definitely a lot of literature about the laxity of the friars, both within the order, criticism coming from the spiritual friars. There are even particular cases in which, certain friars live in almost luxury homes, particularly those who have taken up positions as inquisitors, because they also have different kind of income and they don't share that income with the rest of the order. There is a lot of laxity concerning the educated friars, the lectors, because they have their own cells inside the convent, whereas others sleep all together in a dormitory. Lectors have their own rooms because they need to study and things like that. Yeah, there are a lot of elements of that laxity. I just don't know how to interpret that, because, as I said, next to that anti-fraternal literature that accuses friars particularly of hypocrisy, of doing one thing and saying another, because they preach poverty, they say that we are poor, they present themselves as the poor of Christ, yet you look at the way of life they lead, and that comes because of the fact that already very early on, that is something I didn't mention in 1230, that Franciscans acquired from the papacy the right to use things that they need without owning them, because the Pope declared himself as the sole owner, possessor of the things that Franciscan use. So then, of course, sky is the limit. You can have anything in your convent, but you don't claim ownership for it. Yet, it doesn't matter to the outside eye. If you're claiming ownership on that, you're using it. You live in a nice convent, you have nice food, you have a big library. From the outside, it looks like you have everything you need. Who cares if you don't have the property, the ownership of it? So that was the hypocrisy of it. But as I said, hand in hand with that, the support given to the mendicants never really diminished in the particularly like places like Italian towns, but everywhere really.
So if I can ask maybe as a closing question, what would you recommend for those who want to learn more? Are there any resources you'd recommend for further study of the Franciscans?
Well, yes, I would recommend very much that they read the primary sources, because Thomas of Celano's lives are an amazing resource. I also never mentioned that of Franciscans. We always talked about the male order because also that's my expertise, but there is a female order, St. Clare of Assisi, who was, contemporaneous with Francis and who was very influenced by Francis and who started a very similar order in Assisi, in fact. So there's this, it is known as the second order of Franciscans, the female Franciscans. So there's a lot to be read in that respect as well. And then there is a third order of Franciscans, again, that is something that we didn't talk about. That is the lay people, ordinary people like you and me, having families, holding on to jobs, following Franciscan rule as best as they can without taking a vow to the rule and becoming a friar. So there are these three different aspects. And today, in fact, the third order of Franciscans is quite popular in the United States. There are a lot of tertiaries, they have their annual meetings and stuff. But regarding what might be read, I would strongly recommend that everybody reads, obviously, the Lives of St. Francis, because that's a great reading. And then, there are very good edited books done by the Franciscans themselves. There is the Spiritual Franciscans of David Bow. The Franciscan history in itself is a very tragic, very moving, psychologically very rich history. So it teaches a lot about human nature, I would say, as well as it teaches about medieval Europe.
Dr. Şenocak, this has been an absolute pleasure. Do you have any maybe closing remarks?
Well, I can only say the Franciscan greeting, that is the peace and goodness to everybody. That's Pax and Bonum in Latin. But apart from that, no, thank you so much for letting me speak about Franciscans, because I just love talking about Francis and Franciscans. Thanks so much for inviting me.